Good afternoon, everybody. It's 12:35 here, Central Time Zone here in Minneapolis. So welcome and thank you for joining us today on our monthly webinar series. We've got a uh, great webinar tapped for you today. We have the founder and CEO of Florea Procurement Solutions, Gwen Dougherty, here, and she's going to talk about simplifying procurement. Title of this presentation is Simplifying Procurement, Save Money While Getting the Best Product for Your Money. I can give you a brief intro, and then obviously she can talk about herself a little bit, but Gwen and her company Florea work with cannabis-based businesses as well as other types of businesses to find essentially the best prices and deals, so to speak, on supplies. And specifically, she has a passion for working in the cannabis industry. She does a great job with them. Personally, I know Gwen to be an amazing person, lovely to work with, and just an all-around great person. So we're really excited to have her on this month to talk about this topic. And Gwen, why don't you take it away from here?
Thank you, Mark. Go ahead, next slide, please. So thanks for the introduction. We have been around for about 4 years at Florea, investigating the industry longer than that, but officially, almost half a decade. But our whole purpose is really to help generate extraordinary value for our clients and members, and to really help them to be the most cost-effective and thriving company that they can be, while generating the safest products in the industry for consumers. Next slide, please. And background in procurement, I'm not going to go into much. I want to kind of move through some of these slides a little quickly, but just know we've been doing procurement. Our team has collectively for an outrageous number of years. It's hard to imagine. And over that time, we've created relationships with supplier partners in all kinds of industries, and really across, especially what's called the maintenance, repairs, operational, and facilities side of things, which gives us that opportunity to then bring those relationships to cannabis. Next slide, please. So today we're going to just take a few minutes. We're going to talk really briefly about what procurement is, just to make sure we're sort of on the same page. And then looking at sort of what are some of those bigger expenditures. And we're going to look across a spectrum of operations by type. People who haven't yet got a license, people who have a license and are operating, and those that are ancillary support, so that we can kind of really dig into those different areas and then examine the different needs of those groups. And then just moving through how do we control some costs, what are some opportunities, and then easy steps to start planning for saving, and then tips for how to move forward to get into those savings right away. Next slide, please. So the basics, and this is, it's one of those things, everybody's like, oh, well, everybody buys stuff. But procurement is the act of acquiring goods and services and sourcing suppliers. Everything you need in operation has to be sourced by someone. And so there tends to be sort of a simplistic view, but really it's a very, all-encompassing, systematic approach to making sure that it is done by someone who is coordinating it, and is responsible both financially to the company and helps to make sure operationally things are running, that what is needed is where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be, in the right quantity and quality, and at the right location, especially in operations where there's more than one physical location. So it's both the simplistic act of buying and the complex integrated functionality of looking at the whole system of what's needed: vendors, accounting, vendor management, products, inventory, and also being accountable to teams for having those items. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of break out now into 3 different stages. Operational stage. The first one is the application process. These are for operators, cannabis wannabes. They're in the process of getting into it with the application process and talking about how do they, what's that approach? And really what they're focusing on at this stage is that forward-looking planning for what they're going to be buying and from whom. And it's incredibly important that there be a lot of thought given to this, the specifications put together, which comes down to, in many cases, a brand and model number for major equipment, security systems, including, how many cameras, where they will cover geographically in an operation. So the security component is a very in-depth component, also very costly. Building infrastructure and components. This really, the easiest way to say it is plumbing and electrical infrastructure. And depending on the type of operation that you're applying for a license for, this can be more or less heavy on your plumbing side and versus electrical. And then environmental plans. And the environmental plan is, I use that verbiage because that's what's typically used by the state commissions when they create the regulatory requirements of the application process. And that kind of gets into things like your water plan, whether it's water recycling, water reclamation, water treatment, waste management, so actual physical waste, not water, your air filtration, odor control, and general exterior as well of the building. And during this time frame, a lot of people are starting to hone in on their costs and their suppliers that can service the operation. So they might be doing sort of informal bidding and quoting, but this is a time to really make those key relationships with supplier partners and really keep the communication going. Okay, Katie, next slide, please. Thank you. So identifying some of those key areas of expenditure. And so we've broken them out, and you're going to see this graphic again relative to other types. But this is sort of high level, when you're looking at the application process, really, where are they going to be spending their money? What are things that are sort of a one-time really big purchase that are very, very expensive? So we've outlined those. People often in cultivation think very quickly to HVAC, water and plumbing, air treatment, and racking and lighting. Those are all super obvious. But then there's that deeper level behind the scenes, which is the actual building infrastructure. Don't forget the security piece of it. We don't list it on here because it's such a big independent standalone. Manufacturing, you've got, depending on if you're in edibles or if you're looking more at extraction or what type of manufacturing you're doing, different types of equipment, processing equipment, and of course, fire suppression as well. Racking and palleting and warehousing, obviously there you're looking at more of the moving things around storage wise and getting into more big box type of considerations, reusable containers, and utilities can become a major expense there. So how you plan the building to be efficient, the lighting you choose to go in, the energy types you're using to power the building all have a great expense. And then in retail, we get in very much into security and computer hardware and software, janitorial and office equipment, because it's an office, ultimately it's a retail operation, and then television and the hardware that goes with it, because that obviously becomes an opportunity to merchandise your products. Katie, next slide, please. So I'm going to take just a quick overview. And so relative to what we just looked at in those key expenditures, those are all items that everything we listed that would have to be called out in the actual application process in Minnesota. The regulatory requirement is somewhat written broadly, which basically says that you have to have a detailed environmental plan and an operational plan. And so what I have seen in other states that I've worked with people in this stage is that once you spec a brand and a model for a product, a piece of equipment, changing that becomes very difficult when you actually go to build, and you often need to go back to the commission and get approval. Now, Minnesota may be more or less lenient, but there are other states that once you put down what you're going to use, if you say I'm going to use a Train HVAC and this is the model number, they want to know why it's not in there, and they get very particular in approving operational and the final operation to go live if it's not what they said they were going to do. So that is something to be aware of, and part of the reason why the process of procurement for an applicant actually begins when you start filling out that application, not when it's awarded. At that point, you are definitely committed on a lot of things. And so this gives you an opportunity, if applicants back up their thought process for procurement and begin that procurement process at the beginning of their application process, it actually makes things run smoother and you have a much better control of the actual cost that you're going to be experiencing. So at the bottom there, it's sort of a preview to where we're going, which is that the GPO, Group Purchasing Organization, pricing, often because that process is a competitive bid process to get to a contracted price for those group organizations, many charters, I'll say, don't require that you actually go through that if you're using group purchasing organization pricing. So an example of this would be Native American tribes often require their members to bid to at least 2 to 3 different vendors for single items. So they might, for an HVAC, bid Trane, Daikin, and Carrier, for example. And in this case, then the group purchasing organization has already done a competitive bid. And so you can actually access that pricing and it counts. So there's a couple different things, the nuance to actual getting into acquiring your pricing that is good to be aware there are options. Katie, can you move one forward? Thanks. Okay, license holder. So now you've got your license, you're up and running. You theoretically may already have this operation built. If you don't have it built, then you're going to have some extension of what was happening in the application process. Your spec is laid out. You've already got some items you've already said you're going to put in. So now it's time to do the purchasing. But if you've already got a built out operation, you're really thinking very much in the now. What am I buying? And then looking forward to expansion projects and new relationships that have to be created. So this is a monitor pricing and quality, check your service level, and then really try to solidify those relationships. Better pricing terms is an opportunity once you're established with a vendor. And you can also find alternative or backup suppliers at this point because you have a supplier. Katie, can you go ahead and move it forward? Thanks. So license holder. All the items that we talked about and the categories of purchases from the prior ancillary or the application process sections, those purchases also apply here to some extent. Things like utilities carry over, some of the packaging may carry over, but ultimately there's a different focus on where they're purchasing now. Now it's consumables on a daily basis. Cultivation, your gases and alcohols, your trellis and supplies that go into the grow, irrigation products, they wear out. And filters and light bulbs have to be changed on a routine basis. Your manufacturing into things, and actually throughout all of the operations, PPE is monumentally important, especially as you start getting into clean room. It can be more and more of the PPE. Edible ingredients, whether you're looking for an actual edibles production, or if you have a break room and service like that in your operation, you can also get food items and snack items and coffee service. Packaging, obviously, it's required. The packaging regs are so varied across states that that's something that, again, getting ahead of that back in the application process is paramount. And then electric and gas here. Manufacturing is a huge consumer of the utility cost. And so you really want to make sure you're honing in on that and controlling that cost as you go into operation. Order prep and materials, we get into warehouse. It's kind of an extension of before. Again, it's big box. You're thinking about a shipping operation. It's very logistical. And typically tends to be a lot of waste there. And so that's where controlling your haul away or your actual hauler cost can be pretty important. And then retail, again, you get into consumables, the office supplies, and more importantly, the fun stuff, your custom promotional stuff, the uniforms your employees wear. Katie, go ahead and move it forward. Thanks. So we talked kind of through some really quick ones on people who are actually buying for an operation. So let's take a look at what happens in real life. So we're working with and this is a broad example of what a group purchasing organization and a procurement specialist can support all of those purchases for all those different categories. I've highlighted a couple in the case studies, which I'll talk about. It was a multi-state operator. They were operating in states both in the North and the South, 5 states, and they already had a very professional centralized team of 4 that had come from other industries. And then they also had retail managers at their many retail locations also buying for in those locations. So they had a large team, which was great, but they didn't have the bandwidth really to do the competitive bidding and the long-term planning that their new VP was asking for. They also had an enormous number of vendors. They were almost 2,000 vendors. Not all of them were as active, but technically they all had purchases in a prior calendar year. So their accounting team was asking for some help to sort of streamline that. So the top 10 categories were looked at. Of those, a couple of them were pulled out because they were already pretty optimized. And so we ended up taking a look at 3 key spend, high spend categories that were low emotion. And the reason I say low emotion is because it's hard to sort of dive in and say, we're going to change your grow block. People have, that hits them right where it hurts. And so we actually started out with Uline, Office Depot, and Cintas. They were in that top 10 of vendors, and between those 3 vendors, this operator was spending almost $3 million a year. And so moved products to a new contracted supplier to get a lot of those Uline and Office Depot items consolidated to a lower cost supplier. Ended up retaining those original suppliers. I see Uline everywhere, but they're definitely not the low cost leader. And then took the Cintas business and switched it to a contract and then reduced their uniform cost by almost 32%. So that was a really big one. The PPE, the janitorial are reoccurring purchases that are commonly just you're spending a lot of money on those. And then office supplies are something that we don't think about, but this company actually had dozens of different pens and paper reams, and they just, it was basically a process of both reducing SKUs and reducing vendors and saving price in the process. And no one was sort of upset that they could only buy, 3 different brands of pens in the end. So it's a great example of an overall strategy coming in to just look at things that people were okay making a quick change on that made an impact to the operation. Katie, you can go to the next one. Okay. And then ancillary considerations by stage. So now we're talking about things that these are businesses supporting, obviously, cannabis and hemp. And really where people can get the most bang for the buck is construction and real estate development, simply because those are huge expenditures that they're spending usually on the build out or on remodel process or retrofits. And those are, when they're thinking about procurement, they're thinking about it now and for awarded projects, and then they're bidding future projects. So there's a lot going on the procurement side there. They need wholesale quantities. They are big purchasers. They are not going to buy like a single operation, and you need a slightly different approach to your vendors, what type of vendor you're going to have, and potentially if you need storage, where those products will go. Locking in pricing on those awarded products or projects is incredibly important so they can be delivered on budget. And then getting quotes and keeping that, keeping that wheel moving so that upcoming projects are actually also then kept on budget, but also have your pricing coming in. And then long-term partnerships are really beneficial here. I say that they're obviously beneficial across the entire spectrum, but when we look at the current operator, they tend to have a little more opportunity to be able to move depending on what their need is, or if they're in a physical location that doesn't allow them access to a particular supplier. In an ancillary business, consistent quality, they need to know what they're bidding and get that upon delivery, even if that delivery is 6, 9, 12, or 18 months later. So those long-term partnerships are incredibly important. Go ahead there, Katie. And then key areas for expenditure and ancillary. And again, this is more focused on the building side of things, but all those other categories we talked about in the other overview of products by operation type also are relevant here. So if you are a business owner that has more of a service type business and you run an office, you can still access office equipment, office supplies, janitorial. But when you're talking about construction, you need larger, different suppliers. So I tried to name a few, but we have literally like 6 different suppliers on contract for just electrical. So it kind of would have gotten very cluttered, but the categories here that to think about are really things like big box. You can walk into Lowe's, there's a rebate there. HD Pro is actually something where you've got an opportunity to get those huge, wholesale quantities. Amazon Business, everybody uses them. Grainger is a huge one, even though people can't identify a product. Usually they're like, they have everything. And indeed they do. They have about 200,000 SKUs. And then going through, obviously, pest management is used throughout all operations. And this is less specific by operational type, but items that are used in a building in general. So roofing, flooring, paint, doors, frames, hardware, conveyor systems, elevators, escalators, maintenance of all kinds, rental cars, benefits that go to your employees, sort of general business, both direct and indirect items you spend your money on. Katie, go ahead and move us forward. Okay, so this is again, another opportunity to review a case study here. And we were looking at a real estate developer. And this particular developer had purchased a very old building, had planned major renovation on the entire thing, but in their first sort of few months, they couldn't believe how expensive their energy was. And they discovered that the boiler was from the early 1900s. And so they had to get into some sort of a solution. So a consultant was pulled in. Actually, it was a contracted supplier to actually be able to take a look and say, look, what is needed here? And that is a major project. It did not have the right ductwork. It was quite an undertaking. So they actually didn't immediately embark on that, but they said, we still need help. So it was an opportunity. They had a solution, but it didn't quite work. And so we reach out to a second opportunity, which is actually reducing just lower cost energy on a kilowatt hour basis for electricity. And then that particular opportunity ended up with a 30% cost savings on their electricity cost, which is very material. And then construction materials over time, some other items they were looking for just immediately remedying situations, general construction items. And they had a flooring order literally on one of their first month or two, which was over 25% savings on that. And that sort of got the ball rolling for that particular client. And then they've continued to optimize and use additional vendors, especially on the construction and wholesale side. So an example there of a sort of general plan as well as some specific problem areas. Okay, Katie, go ahead. So the benefits of procurement done well. Go ahead, you can throw them all up there, Katie. Reducing cost of goods and lowering expenses. That's a very, if you're really taking a look at category management and vendor management, here's where you get to. Increased cash flow, better payment terms. We actually had another client, which we did a project on and ended up taking a supplier they were using, putting them onto a contract and negotiating better payment terms. They went from COD to 21 days, which is great because it's cash flow. And then less inventory carrying cost is obviously a benefit of well-managed procurement and just general lower operating costs. I'm going to go over to reduced 280E burden. And this is where my friends, Betsy and Mark, really start to live in this world where they have to look at how do we help our clients on a financial side. And so beyond just the idea of saving money and lowering your costs that you can't otherwise write off, what do you guys see out there regarding either procurement or other ways that people are reducing their burdens?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. First, yeah, I mean, just practically speaking, I think the thing that we find the most when we talk about 280E is it's a big, pie in the sky, it's a big topic there's a lot of different, very complicated tax strategies that you can follow that in theory you could save yourself some money. But we also think just the simplest way to save money sometimes is just by spending less money. And so, sometimes that, whether your expenses are allowable to be deducted or not, if you are able to find ways to save money on regular kind of operational things like supplies, like like the things that you need as a business every day, that reduces the total cash that's going out the door. And in turn, it reduces the effective tax rate that you are paying to the federal and state governments, depending on what state you're in. So yeah, definitely sometimes just the simplest way to think about saving money is just save money, honestly.
Exactly. And it's one that I know everybody is trying to figure out. And this is one thing I think people look very deep into the tax law and to you guys. And sometimes it's, you have to just deal with what we have. And so another way to go about it, obviously, is tackling where you spend your money. Mitigation inflation, I'll move over to that one with long-term contracts. Obviously, making longer-term deals helps you avoid price increases that can then add to inflation. So that can mitigate it in those long-term deals, and supplier relationships often help with that as well. So all of this together, direct contribution to increased earnings at the operation. You can use that additional, or that saved money, reduce debt, increase quality, expand your operation, whatever you choose to do it, you're directly contributing to that through procurement done well. Okay, Katie. So I've talked a little, I sort of threw out the words group purchasing organization earlier in the presentation. And so I want to just kind of come back to that and talk for a few minutes about what is a group purchasing organization and what are the benefits in case you're not really familiar with it. And if you are, we have a question and answer. I'd love to hear your thoughts when we get a little further along about experiences you may have had. So a group purchasing organization, or a GPO, is basically a company that does collective buying. So they take the buying power of the whole group to go out and negotiate contracts on items frequently used in an industry. Typically, they focus on a single industry initially, and then once they have a good base, they may start adding. But one of the great benefits on here, which is it allows for speed to savings and speed to service, because as a member of a group purchasing organization, you get access to all of the procurement efforts that group has done. And the group purchasing organizations that are the biggest in the United States really range in size from about $30 billion up to over $100 billion in collective buying power. So it is a monumental amount of buying power that you sign into. And so they have great expertise on the category side. They are industry experts. And that's really where, we're talking today about cannabis. I focus really on cannabis and hemp industry. And then the ongoing support and savings and the opportunity reports that come out of that are material things that the operators gain by joining that group. Suppliers get access to new markets. It reduces a lot of the friction because the contract's already negotiated between the group purchasing organization and the supplier. So when the actual operator, the buyer, enters the arena, there's not a ton of work left to do. The buyer comes in, the price is typically established, or the discount or the rebate. And so it's easy for the buyer to get started, and it's easy for the supplier to do business. And really, when you look across the spectrum of purchases, an enormous percent of the items purchased in an operation are covered under a contract. Strategic and proactive sourcing is what they do, and that's why it is that way. The group purchasing organization manages all the contracts and vendors, which makes it easy on the buyer. They can get feedback on on a vendor, without having to actually go do the vendor overview and do that work of performance management of their vendors. And then, access, I said these GPOs are between 30 and 100 or over $100 billion. So you're getting access to literally thousands of contracts. I have really reviewed a lot of the contracts with some of the different GPOs, and there's hundreds that are actually relevant. Some of them aren't as relevant as others, but it's easy to say hundreds and hundreds of contracts to choose from on which to save money. Okay, we'll go ahead and move it forward, Katie. So this is the competitive buying process. And I tried to capture this all down at the bottom. We have ongoing activities buyers do, which is they are on a daily basis, running inventory, managing it. They're buying, they're bringing in POs, they're managing immediate logistical issues. But then in the background, this is a process, the analysis, vendor engagement, RFI, request for proposal issued, and then presentations and decision making, vendor preparation to get them ready, implementation at an organization, and rollout. So basically start buying from that vendor. And in large categories, this I've laid it out as about 6 months, a fast process here, 3 to 4 months if you're really, really moving. And so, okay, you can go ahead and go to the next one. So that's a big task that the group purchasing organization is doing. And so in that process, they create reduced cost contracts. It's probably the chief task that is completed. And then they do that competitive bidding on an ongoing basis. So they're continually refreshing pricing, typically 3 to 4 year contracts, sometimes as many as 5 or 6. But they're using that leverage of all of their customers to get the best pricing. And this is a well-established tool. It is used in many, many industries, and certainly all the big ones: hospitality, healthcare, construction, real estate. They are deep users of a GPO. Okay, Katie, next one. And the benefits, which I kind of alluded to, the speed to savings here is probably the biggest thing other than the total company savings. You can immediately catapult to get that, but the operator ultimately remains in control. And what that means is the buyer at the operation, the person making the decisions, gets to decide what to buy and who to buy from. And typically they have an option of more than one supplier partner. So they are getting industry known companies. And the pricing, there's access, obviously, information support, there is account setup support, and it really frees up your procurement person to then focus on high value strategic initiatives at the operating center. It effectively lets you buy like you're big without having a big, expensive procurement team. Katie, go ahead. We'll move to the next one. So it's a great question. I had to put it in here. Obviously, I know I hear this question all the time. And one of the things that people say, look, I already negotiate with my suppliers. Why would I look for somebody else to do that? And the answer is not, well, you shouldn't do that, because individually on a local basis, you're always going to still do that. You're going to have local contracts or local suppliers. And then there is that opportunity to then take advantage of somebody who's doing the big heavy lifting with all that buying power. You may lack bandwidth, might not have enough people to do it. A lot of time we find buyers are the owner of the company. Sometimes it is a controller that is placing orders. Sometimes it's the cultivation team placing orders. Sometimes it's all of these people placing orders. And in that case, it's hard for the team to really go out and then contract and do a full bid process on your big spend categories. So bandwidth, combined buying power, even if you're a big company, sometimes it's really hard to get the buying power. And in fact, what we find is on 98% of our pricing, the best pricing is the GPO. Every now and then we have an oddball come up where there's an individual price on something, but it's a legacy deal. It's been in place for a while. Savings by using the GPO significantly outpaces fees associated with their services. That is something that I know in the industry, GPOs really strive to cover their fees on savings so that then people can understand, look, you're going above and beyond that. And then local teams may not be aware of the hidden fees that are out there from supplier partners, especially in some categories, which is service oriented, where there's a lot of extra fees, whether it's racking fees, delivery fees, restocking fees, fuel surcharges, things like that end up getting tacked onto invoices. And they might think they got a good price on the product, but by the time they get to the actual cost of ownership, it's not such a great deal. And ultimately, GPO customers, because they have the whole buying power of the whole group, They do get priority on delivery, especially when there are product shortages, they will get allocated. And then the other thing, which is kind of comes into, I'm doing a good job on spreadsheeting. Spreadsheeting is the act of taking an Excel spreadsheet or some paper version of it, not much paper left, but I know a lot of people do in Excel, and basically calling around and getting quotes on the items you purchase when you're going to purchase them. It doesn't really encompass the fees and other charges that come with invoices. It's very reactive and non-strategic. It's very tactical, and it never ends. It has to be done continuously because prices change. And it takes an enormous amount of time. And so the sort of the discomfort of going on to just you know what, we're going to take the discounted rate on the off list sometimes takes a little bit of convincing, but ultimately we find the people who are doing spreadsheeting that move on to more of a bigger supported purchasing platform, like a group purchasing organization has to offer, tend to be a little happier at the end of the day because they're actually able to then again move on to more strategic activities. Katie, and moving it on. Thank you. So a GPO procurement specialist is really someone who is essentially the connector. There is a contracting team at the group purchasing organization. They are a machine. I used to work at a really big group purchasing organization, one of the big five, and we had about 60 people in procurement. They were constantly making contracts. They were constantly working on getting the best deals, managing the vendors, looking at the next step, and looking at other categories so that every category got contracted at least once, competitively bid every 3 years. So the GPO procurement specialist is really your connector to bring those deals into your realm, because they are personally looking out for what are you looking for? What do you need? What are your future purchases you're thinking of making? So we can get that in the works. Some of this equipment used in operations, especially some of the big capital equipment like freezers, walk-in freezers, HVAC systems, those, if they're customized in any way, can take 6 to 9 months. That's actually gotten a little better since we've gotten away from COVID. But there were custom freezers going into cultivation and manufacturing operations that were taking 9 to 12 months, right coming out, 2021-ish, because they took a very long time to get it constructed and then get it across the water. So the procurement specialist is that person that helps to make sure the clients are aware of what their time constraints are, the bottlenecks, helps negotiate with the suppliers, better terms, finding out if maybe there's a better deal in their region for them, and then assist the supplier, or the company, in actually setting those suppliers up, getting order guides set up, create the process so that the company doesn't run out. So that comes down into inventory, and then finding deals on items that are maybe not in the norm, or going to find new items that they're thinking about purchasing, that they want them to chase down prices on, and effectively just helping them run smoothly. It is an extension of your procurement team. Okay, Katie. So back to this, mind-blowing slide, which we can't, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a big team to do this for all of the big areas of spend. So answering that question, why can't I just do this myself? You can actually have the benefit of the group purchasing organization, select the categories you want to purchase, and then for items or categories that you're really interested in maintaining, do this process yourself. But it is very time consuming, and it generally takes a long time. Katie, the next one there. And the easy way there, obviously, is the GPO agreement. Is immediate savings. And so at the front end, you can start taking advantage of all the work that those procurement category manager teams have done and get that instant savings by getting signed into as a member of a group purchasing organization. Next slide. Okay, so easy steps to simplify. So 1, 2, 3, designated buyer, having that effective procurement, what, when, and where is it going to be, and then prioritizing spending. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, Katie. Oh, can you go? There we go. Thank you. Does your team have a designated buyer? Now, if the designated buyer is the owner, then they're wearing a lot of hats, and that makes it tough. So either way, you have to have the right tools and resources to effectively save on purchases. But if you have a designated buyer, it does take pressure off of an owner, an accountant, a cultivation expert, or somebody else in the operation. And that really also creates a centralized place. And then choosing the tools you give to that person, whether it is an accounting support service, whether it's a procurement specialist support, also obviously the systems that are used and the processes matter there as well. But making sure they have what they need really helps to make everything else run smoothly. And it also avoids the panic buying, which always results in paying more money. If you don't have a designated buyer, then those outsourced tools become an excellent way to help you buy like you're big, as well as free up the rest of the team to be very strategic by getting some of that help. Accounting support, GPO, procurement specialist support, and software support. Okay, number 2, Katie. Thinking holistically about what you need to help you save is that what, when, and in the right quantity and quality approach, which is sort of now you're getting into buying. So creating the timeline, understanding when things are needed, especially for big purchases and especially for new applicants. Current operators, they have suppliers in play. They are purchasing items already, but the new applicants are looking way out in the future. And for the purchases that you're going to make, especially major purchases of either capital equipment or inputs, having a specification, a written description, detailed of what you need really helps improve consistency for multiple purchases. So if you're buying this item more than once, it also means you can compare pricing apples to apples. If you don't have a spec, then somebody can always charge less. It is a different item. And I will tell you that this comes from everything, even on minor inputs. If you're not comparing apples to apples, somebody always can come up with a cheaper price. When you really get it down to exactly what you need, and this is something that you can utilize experts both from supplier partners to help you create that spec, your buyer, and your operations team can help with those if the buyer is kind of like, doesn't know exactly how to put that together. And then don't forget about purchases like indirect items, your benefits. They're a huge, huge expense in any operation. Outsourced HR can be an opportunity if somebody wants a lean team, and accounting as well. And then things like energy and waste analysis, which come back around when an operation is running and make sure that it's actually running efficiently. And that's usually an opportunity where savings are found as well. Okay, Katie? And then finally, prioritizing your needs. So investigating a GPO is a great option because they help to create the contracted special pricing, the reduced pricing on big spend categories. The earlier, the better if you're in an application process, because they can really give you pricing up front and they can tell you who the vendors are. It makes it very simple. And then prioritizing your purchasing for areas that you spend the most. This is very basic for figuring out where to start. And that's really where your accountants come in. They have your AP spend, and then you work with those top vendors, those top suppliers to be able to find what are the items you're purchasing. And you can really get a wealth of information from those AP reports that come out of accounting. Everybody starts there. It's the beginning of prioritizing if you want to make an impact. And then look and plan months to years or more out. And this is something that does not typically happen in cannabis because people don't think that far ahead generally, because you have to wait to get a license to then move. And once you have that license, you're scrambling to get open. And then once you're open, usually I talk to most people who they're thinking about the next operation, but they're having trouble thinking about the purchases they need to make. And getting into that flow and having a procurement specialist or other resources you can lean on really helps to make sure that those are cost contained, and that the purchases happen in a smooth manner and they're not a bottleneck. Okay, Katie? Okay, I'm gonna take a quick sip here and then I'll go into takeaways. And I know I've been speaking at a rapid pace. We had a lot of information, so we're going to ask questions here in a few minutes at the end, and so I'll go back and talk about anything then, but got a couple more slides here. So really for the new applicant, as I said, this is forward-looking. Identify your procurement partners internally. Who's going to be the person that does it? Who's going to be the project manager? And think about a GPO to help manage that process and organize your information. Bid all your major capital equipment, or if you can use a GPO and they have 2 or 3 different suppliers, get multiple prices for everything and look at really what your opportunities are. Security is the same way. There's a couple big players in the industry. Get prices from multiple companies. And then building infrastructure, people don't necessarily think about this as a big expenditure, but electric and plumbing can be massive depending on the operation. Environmental, we kind of talked a little about that, and it's all encompassing. And the detailed environmental plan requires that you go out and actually look into this early on, and it's an opportunity to cost contain as well. So you're out asking for this pricing, but be realistic with suppliers how far out it's going to be before you buy, because prices will change, and suppliers will not often guarantee pricing for 18 months. And if they do, they're definitely going to put a premium on it. And so you want to make sure you're talking to them, you're getting these bids in from GPOs in particular, but then make sure in your financial plan and with the suppliers that you know it may not be exactly that price when it comes, depending on how far out that is, but it also helps suppliers to create a realistic price at the moment, and also then talk and keep that communication going as things change. Because things change and sometimes prices go down, although not enough lately. Determine your trade references. Okay, this is actually one that is something trade references and your bank or your investors will need to support. You have to put them onto your account applications for your suppliers. All suppliers ask for this, is very standard. And it's something that if you haven't got that organized and together in advance, when you need to move quickly, when you've been awarded that license, you're going to have to scramble to get that together. So these are basically companies you buy from. It typically references the accounting person at those companies, and they just want to know you're in good standing. You pay your bills is what they're going to ask. And so again, very standard in business to set up an account with suppliers and to get credit lines. Okay, Katie, next one. Okay, next step, if you're a license holder, work with your financial professional, work with your accountant, with your controller, with Mark and Betsy. Get your reports to outline your top spend suppliers, and then identify the priority in which you're going to tackle those. And even if you're going to engage a procurement specialist, this is the beginning spot anyway. So prioritize which ones you're going to take a look at, and then go to those suppliers and ask for detailed purchasing reports. And if you engage with a GPO, then a lot of that process can actually be handled with the GPO procurement specialist helping as well. You can then take that report from your accountants and cross-reference it to the GPO contracted supplier list and see which of your suppliers are also on contract that you could, in some cases, immediately start saving. Doesn't always mean you have to change suppliers. And then discuss your future large purchases and company growth plans with your suppliers, if you have identified suppliers, or your GPO procurement specialists, so you can start getting those processes in the bid process and getting specs together, pricing, all those very detailed things so that you actually know what you're going to buy when, and have an idea of your cost. Okay, one more here, Katie. Ancillary. Again, they're buying now. They also have things they need to do in 6 to 9 months. So again, get those reports, figure out your top spend, and then engage with a procurement specialist. This is where it really, on this ancillary, especially in construction, there is a huge benefit to working with a GPO to determine those crossovers, because you're buying wholesale. And so it's really a big opportunity. And a lot of GPO contracts involve volume growth that on an individual operating level of maybe a retail dispensary, they don't have that kind of exponential growth year over year. but construction and real estate development do. So there's additional rebates that can be captured by connecting to those contracts. Okay, Katie, what do we got next? Thank you. What we talked about today, what is procurement, why it matters, both, what does a procurement specialist do, things to be thinking about. And then as far as a significant strategy to significantly reduce cost, looking at a GPO, a group purchasing organization, and then practical tips to just start purchasing today. All of those things are things you can do today. Okay, Katie, I think that's our last one. I think we're on questions now.
Great. Thank you so much, Gwen.
Yes.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and if anybody who's on would like to share another question at this time, just type it in the chat and I can get to it. Gwen, can you just tell us briefly what the process of becoming a member looks like?
Yes. So the process of becoming a member, so Florea is a group purchasing and purchase service company. So our process is we have a membership form that basically our potential members review and sign. And it just says, look, I want to use the contracts and I'm not going to go out and share this pricing all over the industry, because the supplier partners give pricing that's very, very good in return for not having it floating out all over the industry. So that is really the main meat and potatoes of our membership agreement. But in other group purchasing organizations, it's actually similar. I have worked with every one of them over my career. I actually have written parts of those membership deals with some prior employers. And so everybody includes that term. So they're all pretty similar. That form goes in, and then you get connected to, it's about 3 to 4 weeks for actual connection to happen to the contracts. And then individually you can choose contracts, or you can actually just say, look, connect me to everything in the maintenance and construction realm. I want to be on every contract. And then you, go through, if you don't have those suppliers set up, then your partner, your procurement specialist can help you to get your supplier applications set up. Obviously, those have to be submitted by the actual company. But it is a process that moves pretty quickly, and savings, you will realize savings between 4 and 8 weeks after signing your paperwork.
Okay, what happens in that case if you already have contracts with vendors and then you join the group?
Okay, so that's a great question. What if you already have a contract with vendors? People can keep their own contracts. Those are considered locally negotiated contracts. Now, if you have a contract with, like, I had one client that had a Cintas contract, and then we had a Cintas contract. In that case, they elected to move over to the group purchasing organization contract because it was a better contract. But you basically create what's called a vendor exclusion for those vendors, and just say, look, these are going to remain on your own deal, and that's fine.
Great. We have a question here about how you can find a quality GPO to join.
Okay, that's a great question. And there's a crazy, it's a description in the industry, and it's called the fluffy slippers. As people who sit around their slippers all day and they just basically don't ever engage with their members. And so what you're looking for is somebody who engages, somebody who is in the industry that you're in and knows the industry, somebody who is connected to suppliers and is willing to talk to suppliers on your behalf, somebody who understands pricing, competitive bidding, and ultimately somebody who is the advocate for you. And so I think how do you find that person is you're probably going to have to interview a GPO, more than one maybe, and see what they have and what do they charge and how does that balance out with what you need.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question. So when you're part of the GPO, how does the ordering process work? Do you place your own orders, or does that go through the GPO?
Okay, good question. So the ordering process, the procurement, the buyer at the company maintains control of placing the orders. The process back in the membership setup, that is where the person has to identify the vendors. If they just want to be connected to everybody, then we take a look at their account numbers and basically attach those to the vendor so they automatically get the pricing. So when somebody at a company places their order, in the setup process of becoming a member, we take care of attaching that company to the contract rebated pricing. And that is how they get the pricing over to them when they place their orders, but they still place their orders in their normal process. They remain in control of that.
Gotcha. Oh, Gwen, this has been so much useful information. Thank you so much. You all can see on the slide here that we have Gwen's contact information. We will be sending out the slides and a recording of the presentation in the next week. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Gwen, reach out to us at hello@moremwaller.cpa. And we really thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark and Betsy, for having me. Thank you, Katie, for running the slides, and thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
So much. This is great.
Gwen.